All right, Sam, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Good, thank you, Sean.
It's a real pleasure to have you on. I've been lucky to follow you since your rowing days. Since your rowing days, I got your ebook, What Farm, back in the day. I remember that was a really great read, and we'll probably come back to it on this podcast, uh, talking about the performance side. But there was a lot of psychological advice in this ebook, wasn't it? From all your years in elite rowing, and then what you did on the indoor rower as well. So, but before we get into all that, take a couple minutes to tell us a bit about yourself, Sam. Who are you and what do you do?
Let me see, how do I capture this? Who I am now is a father and a coach primarily. What I was prior to that is largely known as an athlete, and for the most part, that was in the sport of rowing. I competed at 2 Olympic Games for Australia in the men's 8, and after that, there was a period of time where I was chasing world records on the ski erg in the indoor rowing machine, and then there was a period of time when I was a power lifter, and now I basically train to feel good, which is, to be fair, a relatively new thing for me. Previously, it was all about performance and how I felt, and my health was just a means to an end rather than the focus. And then when my wife and I had a kid, that shifted a little bit to wanting to stick around, and I realized that there was the expectation that comes with being an athlete, especially if you coach yourself, especially if you're really trying to maximize your athletic capability. It comes with a lot of tension, and so I'm enjoying a phase where I look forward to going to training. I feel good for having done it. It doesn't have any anxiety, even though I'd like to think that I still train relatively hard. So it's new for me, but I'm enjoying it.
So you were a two-time Olympian with Australia in rowing. You rowed in the 8th, right?
Yes, yeah, both times. I spent some time in the Australian men's 4. 2011, I was in the 4. We were bronze at the World Championships, but for the most part, I liked rowing the 8, and that's what the boat that I wanted to be in.
Was it a natural transition for you from the boat to the indoor machine? Was there a period in between where you kind of shifted gears and did something else, or did you go straight from the water to the indoor rower?
Yeah, good question. Well, for all rowers end up having to spend some time on the machine, and I was okay to begin with, probably better than most, but not. I remember my first ever test was 1,000 meters, and it was just with the kids in my year group that wanted to try out for rowing, and I wasn't the best. I think I came second, which is decent, but it wasn't like I was a prodigy. And I could still remember the next year was my first 2K, my first ever 2K. I went 6:58. Then by the end of the year, I was at 6:48. The following year, I was at 6:27. And then I went from 6:27 as a 16-year-old to 6:04 as a 17-year-old. So that was pretty handy at that age. And so I was decent on the machine, and it always was appealing to me, but as opposed to on the machine where it's physiological, but there's not a body weight component. If you can provide oxygen to your body, then more is more, as long as your efficiency is equaled.
Mm-hmm.
But in the boat, that's not the case, and because I'm 6'1", which is basically shorter than all of my teammates. It felt like, in order to maximize my range of motion, I wanted to be as light as possible, as opposed to being as strong as possible, in order to move the boat as effectively, because that's in the end, at the Olympic Games, no one cares about your 2K score. They just care how fast you move the boat. So that was the focus for a period of time. In 2013 was my last year in the water. In 2014, for charity, my friend Matt Ryan and I, who I both rode with in high school and then rode with at the Olympic Games, we decided that we would have a go at the 24-hour two-man distance record. We went 380 kilometers in 24 hours. So it's one guy at a time. Obviously, we kept 20-minute rotations the whole way through. I think we averaged it was 153.6 from memory. And it was like everything I hoped it would be, and it was sort of just alarmingly unpleasant, but also just a great opportunity to go really deep and to see what we were capable of and to do it with a good mate. So it had a lot of upside. It's also about 23 hours and 58 minutes longer than kind of my ideal duration. Even 2K is kind of longer than my physiology. So after that, with no real reasons to try and keep my weight below its set point, which is where it had been for the last decade, basically my 20s, I was 10 kilos lighter than my body wanted to be. So I just leaned into it and was able to get a lot stronger. And I spent 6 weeks to go for the 1,000-meter record on the ski erg, mostly because I thought that I could do it, even though I had no experience on the ski erg. It seemed achievable, and it was a pretty moderate world record at that time. And it just felt like it was something to try out, and 1,000 meters was digestible. And so after I broke the world record, I thought, okay, let's do something a little bit more serious, which is the 1,000 meters on the row machine, which I also felt capable of breaking and use some of the training that I undertook for the ski erg, some of the interval and the format for training was relatively similar. I was able to sort of expand and develop that a little bit. And
how many tries did it take you to get the 1,000 record on the
I probably spent 3 or 4 months training for that, with a pretty focused intention. There's things that I did incorrectly that if I were to do it again, I would probably do it a little bit differently, but
what would
that's
you change?
The nature of it.
What would you change?
Well, I'd say this for the 500, which I later attempted. I would have emphasized rest a little bit more, and there was just probably too many times when I was on the limit or over it. There are things that I did that I think were really good, in that I emphasized only really high quality work. So I did all of my aerobic training, so sort of U2, T2, whatever you want to call it, on the assault bike, or was it Airdyne at the time? And that meant and I could sort of rest my back a little bit. Not that I had any issues, but I wanted to ensure that continued to be the case. And then on the row machine, it meant that any stroke that I took had some reasonable pressure. So I was replicating a pattern that would have some transference to needing to pull. I needed to sit on 119 for 1,000 meters to break the record. So from catch to finish, I wanted it to be as good as I could be technically, and I wanted to make sure that there was handle pressure every stroke. And so there was, I think for that entire preparation, I didn't do anything slower than 145, where it's about 300 watts. And most of it was a lot more intense than that. But there was just a lot of the lifting and the rowing was all very intense, and I think I would have spaced it out to just fewer key sessions. Overall, there would have been a little less anxiety with the training experience, and I think that probably, even though it was imperceivable at the time, just the expectation of this session is going to be do or die, and you only want an amount of those, and I may have just flirted with the edge a little bit there. After the 1,000 meters, the only thing left for me in the indoor rowing side of things was the 500-meter record, which I felt less confident than I did for the 1,000 meters. It was always going to be a bit of a stretch, whereas the 1,000 meters, the sort of 2 to 3 minute mark is probably ideal for me. But I thought that I wanted to give it a go, and I wanted to learn from the process and see what I could do. And then that's basically what happened. I ended up being, I think, less than a second away, but for 500 meters, that's a reasonable amount. At the time, it was, I think, the second fastest ever. Now it's probably somewhere in the top 5. I don't really keep track that much, but I know that there's certainly some big boys out there going fast. James Hall broke my 1K record the other day, and I wouldn't say I was glad to see him do it, but I certainly wasn't unhappy, because this is the nature of things. And my friend Matt and I, who broke the 24-hour record, we've always said if 2 guys want to come along and beat that they should go for it. I would be the first to clap them, because I would know what it what it took in terms of preparation and then execution.
I want to come back on what you said about, spending relatively, I wouldn't say little time on the rower, but not as much time as some people might think, especially for the shorter distances. I was fortunate to have the French Masters champion on the 500-meter on the podcast recently, and he said something similar to you, which is you only want to have good strokes on the rower, because otherwise, if you train slow, you're training to be slower. And to give some perspective, at 119 that you mentioned before, that's 700 watts. And
yeah, so that was for the 1,000.
Exactly.
The 500 was 111.
Yeah. So we can imagine how training at 200 or 300 watts isn't representative of what a stroke might look like at 7 or 1,000. So it's interesting that you also took that approach, and in hindsight would have done even less on the rower and maybe more on general modalities.
Something I would have probably fewer sessions. I think you could, like, that stuff at 200, 300 watts is, like, the caveats to that is the energy system that trains is still necessary for those distances. It's just whether or not you need to do that on the rowing machine.
Yeah.
And I also had at that stage, like 15, 20 years of pretty consistent aerobic training to fall back on. So even though it wasn't my strength, I had some sort of residual carryover. But I think what people underappreciate is the amount of effort that's required to produce those really high wattages. And it's a bit like lifting heavy. I think people would have a hard time wrapping their heads around the reality that the strongest guys in the world, when they're squatting really heavy, they're taking like 10, 15, 20 minutes off between sets.
That's it.
And it seems unreasonable. It seems even taking 5 minutes off is too much, but it's a bit of a chicken and egg type thing, because if you never allow that space, then you're never going to be able to reach the top of your capacity, which will then demand that greater rest. So you kind of just stay with this meddling, putting a limiter on your capability, because you're not allowing yourself to better express your top end range. And I I don't think you know unless you are convinced of it and then act accordingly, or you go through it yourself and actually try and find out.
And the more you advance and the higher your level, the more that becomes true, right? The higher cost there is to a max effort on your system as a whole. And so it's almost like the farther you go, the more polarized you have to be in how you train, and allowing those big rests, allowing more time between sessions. Like you said, maybe fewer, very intense sessions because they cost so much, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if you're coming from a rowing background, the elite guys do the most volume, and going from sort of sub-elite college rowers, that sort of thing, the major thing that changes isn't an increase in intensity, it's an increase in volume. So people from that background, which I was from that background, tend to think that more is more. And when I was rowing, that was I definitely went along with that as well, if not more than most. But at the higher intensities, it's just not the case. I mean, we would routinely race a 2K like a couple of times in a day, or multiple times over, like a World Cup is, you race 3 times in 3 days, whereas my 500-meter attempts, I was still tired several days later, and it was just over a minute of effort. This was sort of I went through this like perplexing phase where people would, anytime there was a really intense metabolic challenge, like a minute on an assault bike for $200 on, like at some gym or some Instagram account, and I the suggestion would be I should just do this because I might do okay and it might be fun. But it's like, I'm going to bury my dick in the dirt for that, and I'm going to be tired for a week for something that's not that relevant to me. And the reality is that there's some real freaks out there. My capability, if anything, is knowing what to do and then committing to that process. And I'm pretty adaptable to training, but that's not the same thing as just having talent that you can deliver. So any of these goals that I've had, it's something that I've had to train for and then execute. So those things are never especially appealing to me, nor does the motivation of others really move me much at all.
I want to come back on that ebook that you wrote a few years back called Lots of Watts. Link is in the description for people interested. What got you to writing this ebook? What was your let's say your framework at the time, and what did you try and put down on paper?
Yeah, so at that period of time was coming towards the end of some of the stuff I was doing on the indoor rowing machine, and at the time I was a rowing coach, and it occurred to me that in the near future that both of those might be behind me, and rowing would then become this thing that I did as opposed to a thing that I still do. And so I thought it'd be good to capture some of my thoughts on that may be useful to others. I think that it was more broadly applicable than just indoor rowing, although that was certainly the focus. It included some stuff on strength training, nutrition, and the psychological components you mentioned. But fundamentally, I wanted to, what interests me is to begin with a sort of a selfish endeavor, like what can I do? How can I be better? And through the process of trying to make myself better, you learn a thing or two that may be useful to others, and more that's become the thing that I'm interested in, especially from the perspective of having done things the wrong way, or at least suboptimally. So if I could save someone the effort of running 100 miles an hour in the wrong direction with best intentions, then that just feels like something I'm inclined towards doing. And that's the upside of being a coach.
If you were to think back to some of the things that you wrote, is there anything that you would change today, or that you would do slightly differently than what you outlined in the book?
I haven't looked at it in a while. I don't think things would have changed fundamentally. I would probably have to look through it to get back on you. I'd imagine some of my perspectives of evolved somewhat, but I was emphasizing from memory quality and recovery in order to encourage adaptation, which is the point of the training process. It's not about who does the most work. Again, on the start line, definitely at the finish line, it's not a matter of who's done the most work. It's just who's the fastest or who's the best. And with the goal being as it is, people, and myself included, are inclined, especially if they really care, to do as much as they can, as opposed to doing what they need to, which isn't necessarily less. It just changes the emphasis. So I'd imagine I'd be reinforcing that.
If you look back on your rowing career as a whole, water, I mean, boat and indoor, what are your fondest memories of those times?
I have a few. I had quite a bit of success in high school, which was an interesting process because my final year of high school, I nearly didn't row because we were so terrible. The 3 years before that, we didn't win a race. Not a single, like, I never won a rowing race. I was like, this is kind of shit. Meanwhile, our rugby, the school I went to, we were one of the best rugby schools in the country, if not the world. And so I was thinking, how about I just play basketball, lift weights, and then go play rugby? My mum actually encouraged me to just keep going till Christmas, which was the halfway through the rowing season. And I thought, yeah, okay, fair enough. And basically, like, if we're doing it, that I'm going to be like kind of go crazy with the thing, and or just not at all. And fortunately, there was a group of guys that were of a similar mindset. So we were training far more than school kids should train, or I mean, like, it was 18 times a week kind of thing in high school. So there wasn't any mystery how I went to 6:04. We were just doing a lot of work, and we won every race that year. And for better or worse, that marked me psychologically, in that I felt as the more I took ownership of the process, the better things tended to go, and that you could simply sit there and be a passenger in the process, and things will go how they will, or you could take some ownership of it and maybe influence the outcome more than you would expect. And that occasionally bit me in the ass, because in an 8 on the national team, at times you need to be a cog in the machine. And so that was something that I had to work with moving forward, as is just even though we did a lot of high quality training, just did a lot of training that was like, okay, more is more. And then that tended to be my bread and butter for the next little while. College, just because of the demands of the academic load and the social side of things, meant that we probably did less training in college than I did in high school, but it was still a high standard, and we had a lot of success. And so I have some good memories there. I went to Princeton University in the US, and my teammates on the my college team were some of the guys I rode against internationally a couple of years later. Domestically, after I came back from college in the US, it would not be reflective of me speaking to the high points of my rowing career to not talk about the King's Cup, which is a race that we have in Australia for the states and provinces. So New South Wales versus Victoria versus Queensland, and it's massive for bragging rights. And and the first year I came back, we came second. And I remember there was a moment where the guys that won, the Victorians, who are our rivals, were with the champagne, and they're like, and basically we're all like, I remember the sting in my eyeballs from being shot in the face with champagne. And we thought to ourselves, okay, that wasn't very fun. How about we win this thing next year? And then we won it for the next 6 years. And so that was pretty good. There was also some World Cup wins and medals and World Championship medals on the national team, which but broadly I felt as though myself and we underperformed relative to our capacity when it really counted at the Olympic Games. And in the men's 8, it's all the 8s that are there have a lot of talent, but it really needs to be the crew that gets it together at the right time, and we weren't able to do that. So and then I guess I think about that more than the indoor stuff, because the indoor is just so just a different. I think of them as two different things, and one of those was like more selfish, even though the benefit hopefully is that my insights can help others. But I also just remembered being it felt like it was necessary, and it wasn't unenjoyable, but I felt like I did what I was capable of, and was able to focus on that and enjoy the training process and go really hard at it, which I enjoy. So that's probably how I reflect on that.
You were already moving significant amounts of weights when you were on the indoor rower. You were doing a lot of strength training, obviously, for those distances and the demands of the time domain. That was obviously beneficial to you. How did you decide to get off the rower and then start training for powerlifting specifically?
Yeah, well, with the rower, I basically been doing it for 20 years, and 20 years at a sort of intensity that people are unlikely to do for a year or a week. And so I didn't feel like I slayed all those dragons, but that almost enough was enough. I didn't have anything I could have just kept going again for the 500 meters, and maybe I would have got there, or tried to have the 1,000-meter. I wanted to. There were certain things I wanted to do. Like I went under 550, so 549 as a 30-year-old, which and with a job and on half training load, so I felt good about that. And it got to a point where it was like nothing really for me to be excited about anymore. And then all of the things that people dislike about the rower, and that like, hey, this is like that's what I would have been doing. Like, whereas before I didn't have any of that. And so I think it's probably just paying attention to myself and what I wanted to do. Meanwhile, the lifting of the weights in order to get stronger for the shorter stuff on the rowing, that did still have some appeal. And that was off the back of the whole time I was rowing on the water, my strength was my strength. So I didn't get to do an awful lot in the gym. I didn't do an overhead press for like a decade because I just didn't need my shoulders to So I just wanted to lean into that a little bit more and see what would happen if I pulled back on some of the glycolytic and aerobic work and gained a little bit more weight, what it would be like to push my strength a little bit more, and just to have that like athletic experience. The same reason that like I ran a marathon in 2009. I've run a bunch of halves just to, like, I want to check that out, not just to check it out on the day, but train for it, feel what it feels like, to know what that experience is like. I've done weight cuts just for fun, just to be able to better understand that experience, because that's part of a lot of the sports that I'm interested in particular, combat sports, weightlifting, the powerlifting. They're all divided by weight categories, and so that's a unavoidable element. And so in the end, I just pulled back on some of the stuff that wasn't lifting, basically, and got stronger. The challenge was that I also moved from Australia to the US and started a full-time job with Adidas, and that it gave me that's what it's like for most people. They've got a job and their training is a hobby, and that was always the thing for me as well. After I was stopped rowing full time, but more and more as I've gotten on, training was the thing that everything else orbited around. And then now this has shifted to training is the thing that I get in when I get it in.
Talk about that other transition that you made from, so you did the lifting, you did some marathons, like you said, just prepping for different events, kind of seeing the lay of the land. You did the really short stuff, you did the long stuff, you did the heavy stuff. And in the past little while, and as you said, probably part of that transition is, becoming a father and having a, which is a pretty significant life change, and everything that it entails. For me, it definitely highlighted the importance of sleep. That's my first question that I ask anybody who, just became a mother or father is, are they sleeping, and are you sleeping? My wife had
good question. Sleep is, at the moment, it's no complaints.
Good.
A kid gets up between 5 and 6, which is fine. Like, that's what it'd be getting up anyway. There was times when it's a bit below 5, and I'm less excited about that. It also just is what it is, and it could be a lot worse. You hear some horror stories. Our son has tended to sleep pretty well. At the moment. He sleeps through the night, so have very little to complain about. And even if it weren't good, I wouldn't complain about that either, because you sign up for it, and it could always be worse. And from my understanding, it certainly is for others. So there was over a year when he was in the same room as us, so that was like interesting and definitely had an impact. And this was like a part of me growing up, emphasizing rest as opposed to work, had meant that before we had our kid, sleep had become more and more of a priority to me, and something I'd made space for and insisted on being mindful of, and routines, and changed my eating in order to have better quality sleep. And then the whole thing just sort of blows up when you have a kid. And but that's like that also, how would I know what that's like for others if not to have that experience? So not like no problem at all.
What would you say are the main tenets of a quality night of sleep for you now? What do you try to emphasize? What are the most important points to focus on?
Yeah, so part of my understanding on sleep is from experience, but also from the literature. And some of these things don't occur to me until, like, even no matter how obvious they are, until I read it somewhere and then actually think about it and then try it. And then it's like, okay, that seems obvious. One of those is not eating too close to bed. I think in a vacuum, people should stop eating 3 hours before they go to sleep, in just for sleep quality, but it's not that practical. Especially if you're an athlete that needs to get in sufficient calories. If you're a teenager or in your 20s and you've got a high output and a high metabolism, it is a little bit different, and you're sort of having breakfast cereal after dinner, after dessert, and that's not a problem. But when I was pursuing some of the shorter stuff on the rower and getting stronger and allowing myself to eat more food and playing around with intermittent fasting, so I was backloading my day quite a bit. I was basically having 3 meals within 4 hours, and then just sort of like, and then basically going to bed. And it felt fine until I was like, no, hang on, I probably got a bit of reflux, and I'm like a anaconda that's swallowed a sheep every night. So my body's digesting as opposed to recovering. And so 3 hours for me isn't reasonable, but I don't eat after 8 p.m. Even so, I have at least an hour and a half, which is probably more reasonable. And I can imagine some world in which I move that even more. And the timing is consequential, because from my understanding, the consistency is even more important than volume. So you want to be able to go to bed at the same time and wake up more or less the same time every day, which is also, I think, challenging. But when I didn't do that, it wasn't challenges. It was, no, like, I just want to watch another episode of this thing, or I want to finish this chapter. And so, oh, it's 11. Like, I think it's a lack of discipline, and whether or not it's a big enough a priority for you. So I would say consistency of routine and eating be a big part of that. I also go for a walk with my wife and kid after dinner every night. That helps digestion and helps that process, and is part of the routine. I think sleep environment is pretty important. So if it's quiet, which may or may not be within your control, you do your best. Dark. So I people like big airy rooms. I want a cave. I want it to be zero light coming in, which is practical some of the time. If it's your home, then you best believe that you see my bedroom, it's going to be dark and then cool. I think use the tools you have. So some people don't like AC, but air conditioning, fan. I have an 8 sleep, which have you tried one of those and know what that is?
I have not tried it, no.
So it's a mattress topper that it has a grid system of like little pipes that it runs water through.
Okay.
And the device controls the temperature of that water. So if a fan or air conditioning is somewhat effective towards cooling you down, and you do need to be cool, it does have it's different for everyone, but cooler is better on average, and even slightly cooler is for you is better than not. The amount might vary, and given that conduction is far more effective than convection for transference of temperature, it's super effective. I tend to recommend it to anyone that has the means to invest in getting one of these. I think I think I sound like a salesperson for the thing. I think they're available in the UK, US, Australia. I'm not sure where else in Europe, but 8 Sleep is worth checking out if you're interested in optimizing your sleep environment.
That's really interesting. One thing I've done consistently for, I would say, the last year is earplugs and some kind of face mask, or even just a headband that I put over my eyes, and just having the no sound and the dark helps me tremendously. I don't travel without them. I'll take them with me, and I look ridiculous when I go to sleep, but I'm happy to take that, and because it does make such a big difference for me.
Yeah, I think if you can get used to that sort of thing, especially if it increases your ability to sleep well when you travel, because a lot of the things I speak to is important. If I travel to a different time zone, routine is gone, and the sleep environment might not be the same. That I'm not going to have, like, sleeping without this 8 Sleep now is kind of, this is not nearly as good. And so that's the other side is, yeah, you can get quite particular, but then you're a little less adaptable. And so having some component that you do travel well with is smart.
So we talked about sleep, and there are other aspects of, health and everyday things that we can put in place that are important. You're coming out with a program called Preseason. Is it launching today, or is it?
Yeah, so
It is.
launch
Okay.
today. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
launched today. So it's called Preseason, and one of the tags you use is the Everything Else program, which I really like, because there are, virtually an infinite number of programs on the training that you need to do, but there's actually very, very few programs per se, structured approaches to figuring out all the things that are going to essentially make or break your training, because you could do all the right things in training. If you don't have, I forget his name. I had him on the podcast a long time ago. He called it the other 23, right? As in, you train for an hour, and people like you or others might train a lot more, but I mean, you train for a small fraction of the day, and the rest of your day is when you are going to adapt from that training, when you're going to assimilate those changes or not. So how did this preseason idea come about to you?
I mean, you've exactly got the concept. So thank you for that. It's largely, it was off the back of my increased emphasis on, if I'm doing everything I can within training to maximize performance, then what else is there that within a 24-hour day that I can either utilize to improve my recovery, or it's a liability towards lowering my recovery and therefore my adaptability and therefore my performance. And there's far more opportunities outside of training. But even if you just view it from a perspective of, okay, training's important, I'm going to do that as well as possible. Let's assume that's a given. If that's fixed, then there still provides you with the opportunity for everything else, which is not only there, but also super consequential. So that was relevant to me, but I also noticed that in the coaching that I do largely online, a big part of it at the outset is for the client to clarify their goals, because that is the backbone of the work we do together. It's basically their goals relative to their lives with the resources they have, and then that's the approach we take. And oftentimes, though, their aspirations were reasonable and they were committed to the training process in theory, but there was not exactly no stone unturned. It was all eating wasn't as it needed to be, and sleeping wasn't as it needed to be. They weren't getting themselves to bed on time, and they weren't doing the little things. And so we always needed to, and I still continue to have to, work through that stuff first before we can go kick ass down here. So I was thinking what would be a scalable approach that anyone could do that would serve that purpose. So that would be a program that they could follow along that would pay attention to the stuff that they needed to. The challenge is this is the stuff that people don't want to pay attention to, and it gets people in some it gets them in their soft, squishy areas that they would rather avoid. So with 3 weeks left to the program, you go to an hour or less per day of TV, social media, and gaming, and that's super achievable. And I think people in theory would go like, yeah, I can do that, because of course they could. But when it comes down to it, that's a lot harder for people than they think it is. But the harder it is, the more likely it is that that's something you need to do.
In the process of building this program, what are some of the topics you've investigated that you've learned the most about, and maybe that you were the most surprised about?
Yeah, so, well, nutrition and sleep, the big ticket items, and like those things, like we've discussed sleep, but I think everyone's conscious of nutrition being a key component when it comes to all of the stuff that I'd imagine your listeners are interested in. Something that was surprising to me, and it took me a while to pay attention to, and then practice, and then make routine, and then be able to enjoy the benefits. And so is breath work. And because I think breathing is something we do unconsciously to survive, and most people think I breathe fine because how would they know any differently? So this was another thing where I had to look at the evidence and be told a bunch of times by people I respect, like not be told, but this is how I view the sort of people that I respect on social media. If they say something that I'm not paying attention to, that I don't intuitively understand, I feel like they're telling me, pay attention to this. And either I do or I don't. And there was a period of time, maybe even years, where I was like, oh, that's cute. You're going to sit there and you're going to breathe. And then there was, I probably can't reveal too much because of non-disclosure agreements in my time at Adidas, but I'll say that I got to look at a lot of recovery data from a lot of athletes for a period of time. And insofar as alcohol adversely affects recovery, so lowers heart rate variability, increases resting heart rate, lowers sleep performance, increases respiratory rate, breath work was the only thing that did the opposite across the board. Not meditation, not cold baths, not sauna, not paleo, not vegan, not carnivore. All of those stuff could make the needle, and it would depend a little bit on the individual and how they implemented it. But breath work seemed to work for everyone on these metrics that we were paying attention to, and that people are paying attention to. Like, they're reflective of the state of the athlete more as being the goal themselves. But if these things are important, the data is just a measure of those things, and it's worth paying attention to the tools that actually move the needle rather than just the tracking of the data. So breath work is something I've been paying a lot of attention to. It's part of preseason. It begins on week 2, so you've got 5 weeks of breath work, and I provide you with basically a way to provide yourself with a protocol that is appropriate to your level, which is important, and something that I'm trying to do with my colleagues with a startup that I co-founded called Numa Plus, which is basically a breathwork app that it's there to build stress resilience, but it
Mm.
also improve sleep and recovery. And it's customized and adaptable, which is to say that it's instead of a generic, how we're going to do box breathing, in for 4, hold for 4, exhale for, like, that's going to be the same for you and for me and
Mm.
my dad and everyone. No, this is as though we would do for any other activity. You've got 2 people, they both want to run a marathon. It's not going to be the same program if they're not the same people with the same ability. So this stuff needs to be individualized, and that tends to be the breath work that I prescribe.
That's very interesting. I've got two questions that come to mind. I'll ask them both, and you can pick which one you'd like to start with. The first one is, what have been your biggest influences in the world of breath work, and that have kind of directed your way of thinking or influenced it the most? The second one, back to what you were just saying here, what parameters do you use to then, and if you can talk about it, to individualize the breath work? Just like we might have, going back to your rowing days, a lot of programs are based on your 2K split. So you would have a 2K test, and then you would take, 2K split minus something or plus something,
exactly.
to base your training. So with breath work, I feel I'm fascinated by breathing. I think it's definitely a stone that has not been turned over, like you as you mentioned, for most people, and whether it's both for health and performance. I think there's fantastic implications on both ends of the spectrum, and across the board. And I'm interested to hear, what you've been looking at in terms of quantifying the status of a given individual to then better orient and individualize their training. So whichever one you want to start with.
Yeah, I'll start with the influence, because it's largely one person, or not exclusively, but largely a guy named Brian McKenzie. You can find on Instagram. I think he might be _ Brian McKenzie, but if you go to my Instagram and then look in my followers or who I follow, you'll be able to find him if you're interested enough. And Brian tends to be about 5 years of the broad understanding of these things. Now, I tend to think that I'm about 2 years ahead, which means he's about 3 years ahead of me. So nowadays, I just pay attention to what he's saying and try and understand where he's coming from, which isn't always easy. He and I have had a friendly point of contention recently, where he thinks that his point of view is that things can't be improved. It just changed, but it's not better or improved. It just is what it is. And I'm like, fuck, man, I think if it's measurable, you can improve it. But because of his track record, I tend to try and keep a really open mind. And he was one of these influences that I pay attention to when it comes to breath work, and eventually went from paying attention to doing something about it. And Brian would say that breath work, more than improving recovery or sleep, although he would say that he would acknowledge that it may have a positive influence there as well, he would feel that breath work gives us an opportunity to learn about ourselves in a way that is harder nowadays, because we're somewhat disconnected from ourselves. Like the wearables and the tracking, all of that means we outsource introspection to these devices, which may or may not be accurate. So he's certainly been influential when it comes to the testing side of things. When it comes to preseason, there's one test when it comes to Numa, which is the app. It includes 2 tests and a psychological assessment, so it's more comprehensive. In both is an exhale test, which is basically the maximal time that you can take to exhale through your nose. So the full setup for the test is you sit there or lie down for 5 to 10 minutes. I think it takes longer if you have more metabolically active tissue. So I try and sit for a while and take 3 normal breaths all through your nose. This is all through your nose. I mean, just the nose through mouth is a whole conversation in itself. Through the nose 3 times normally, and then on the 4th, big inhale, maximal inhale, and then you're timing the exhale to completion. So if you breathe or if you swallow, that's the score. I think it's good to do it a couple of times to get a feel for it, but that's fairly indicative of certain qualities, more broad than just the tests. In similar how a 2K, it assesses your strength and your fitness, but it also assesses your psychology. This assesses your sensitivity to CO2, and your sensitivity to CO2 says something about your psychological and physiological resiliency. So that test is key. We also use a step test, which is you do the same 3 breaths, and the 4th big inhale, empty, and then on empty you start walking and you count the number of steps, and that too is a metric of relevancy. It's more relevant for your active CO2, which is more reflective of your CO2 tolerance in metabolically demanding activities. So for athletes, it has more application. And then we have a psychological assessment, and the idea is all of these things allow us to better understand the person at the outset and scale their training accordingly, but they are also become measures of progress over time.
It's really interesting because it's really bringing some, and I don't want to say by that there wasn't any structure or there isn't any structure with other breathing practices, but you mentioned the impact that, you know, seeing the data has had on your understanding, and maybe even if I may say that, on your willingness to say, hey, this is something that I have to pay attention to. Like, I can't leave it on the side anymore. It's too obvious and I have to do something about it. And I find it really fascinating how it's really a world that is, I guess it's probably the oldest world that there is in terms of human understanding, if we think back to ancient traditions and that side of things. And then it's also one of the newest ones in our Western world today, because maybe we've just forgotten that this was, you know, that we had access to that. Like you said, we breathe automatically until we decide that we control how we breathe. And what's interesting in that is that the respiratory system is tightly linked to our nervous system. And that's one of the only ways that we actually have access to influence it directly. And once you understand that, it really opens that door. But I'd say that there is still a lot of resistance to the idea that, hey, we're going to spend some time looking inwards. It frightens a lot of people, right?
Yeah, the people, and I was there myself, so there's no judgment, but it seems like it's not going to be that consequential. So it's just hard to include on a day that feels busy. Although if you got like, show me your smartphone and tell me your screen time and how much time you spend on Instagram, I think it would indicate that they do have some disposable time in their day. So it's not, that's not the reality. The reality is that there's a reluctance, and I think that just the difference for me is that I was able to go from the place of reluctance to at least let's try it out. And then once I tried it out, I saw the benefit. And then for me, now I can't not do it, because to me, it's like not eating well or not taking care of myself. And so I just fully converted. But I think there's a couple of things, just that the point that you made about the ability to control our nervous system. I think because breathing is unconscious, that exerting conscious control over it indicates something to ourselves about our capacity to exercise control over our physiology, which in of itself, regardless of the measurable benefits, is important and is similar to the entire training process. Like bodybuilders that they want to change their physiques, or people that want to get stronger, lift more weight, or run faster, or run longer. It's all about exerting influence and seeing what your body can do. And breath work is the most accessible. You don't have to sit down and like with an app and do a specific protocol. You can just pay attention to your breathing. That's probably a good place to start. Like, take moments throughout the day to check in with how you're breathing. I would notice, and still do, if I'm not managing myself, I'll find myself holding my breath. And there's a lot of people that they are either doing that or hyperventilating. So if you can breathe deeply through your nose, and in particular slowing down the breath rate and slowing down the exhale, then this is going to positively influence your nervous system, which will positively influence your recovery, which, if you're paying attention to sleep and nutrition, with that being the goal, then this is another lever you can pull.
And for the competitive folks listening in, and the athletes that are hearing all this and that think, well, that slow stuff, that easy stuff, that's not for me. I need to go hard. This is what my sport is requiring. I think we can make the parallel with the slow and low intensity, long duration stuff is beneficial to high intensity, and we know that from all the data that's available on any type of endurance sports. And even to the shorter distances, there's a huge requirement there and a huge transfer. And I see the breath work and breathing as the same, as in better controlling your breathing when you're at rest is going to give you that level of detail even when you're in harder, more difficult, intense situations. Knowing how to control your breathing can have a tremendous effect on your rate of perceived exertion, right? We know that respiratory frequency during activity is tightly coupled to how hard you perceive the activity to be. And if we're able to control our breathing better during an intense effort, it's inherently going to feel easier. And if it feels easier, you might actually be able to go for a little bit longer or even a little bit faster. And that's I think an interesting point to bring forward for those who might think that the easy stuff in breathing might not be beneficial at all for the hard stuff. I think it is. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. You do all that hard stuff. Just do this as well. And I feel like, as I'm talking about sleep and breath work nowadays, like, I at least have some runs on the board, and like I've gone as hard as you can do. And I wouldn't discourage anyone from that. I think this just makes you more able to do that rather than not. And almost everyone is recovering between sets, whether they're sets of squats or they're sets within an interval. Like, even Ironman nowadays are doing interval sets, and your recovery between those is going to be far better if you can control your breathing.
Yeah, 100% agreed. So preseason, your new program available today. The link is in the description. The website is thewattfarm.com/preseason for the program. Sam, I want to thank you for taking the time to come in on the show. It's been, like I said, an honor following your work for many years now, and just seeing the evolution of everything that you've done and that you've put in place, and all the different areas that you've investigated is, again, really, really fascinating to me. So I really want to thank you for coming on the show today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And it's fun to talk about this stuff. I hope your listeners, if they didn't learn a thing or two, there's a few things that they might be more interested in having a look at. If that's the case, we'll have done our jobs here today.
Fantastic. Where can people find you online if they want to follow your work, Sam?
Yes, I'm at Sam Loch, LOCH on Instagram, and that's where you can find me.
Fantastic. Have a fantastic day, my friend.
Yeah, thanks, Sean.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, please take a few moments to leave a written review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. If you want to watch this episode again, you can find the full video recording on my YouTube channel. You'll also find hundreds of hours of free content, all my podcasts, my thoughts of the day, structured presentations, and more. So don't wait, go subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.